Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. I received an email a while back, and I'm just now having a chance to respond to it. A woman writes to me and asks this, she says a few things, and I'm just going to read it to you. At first, I won't tell you this part. She says some very kind things about me and my podcast, which is very sweet. Then she says this: I was interested in your thoughts on the subject, megachurches. I know that is a general topic, but I'm very interested to know your opinion on these big churches that have pastors who rake in very large salaries. Do you believe that they are truly workers for the kingdom, or are these people following, quote, false prophets? I'll pause there just for a second because she has a few questions. I want to pause there. Well, first, let's do a little bit of definition. Did you know the average size church is around 150 people? Here's how Tom Rainer says it, based on his studies, and this is all kinds of studies demonstrate this kind of thing. 50% of all churches in America, 50%, average fewer than 100 in worship attendance. Let that sink in. One out of every two average fewer than 100 people in worship attendance. Now, attendance, not membership rolls. 40% average between 100 and 350 in attendance. And 10% average more than 350. 10% of all average more than 350. A megachurch, in modern parlance, means a church that has 2,000 attenders on a weekend, a minimum of 2,000. But some might say even 800 to 1,000 is massive megachurch. That is to say, most people in the country go to something that is not a megachurch. Then the question, of course, is, well, what do we do about that? A megachurch, to me, is just a really big church. That is to say, if it's done well, it's still a church that's preaching based on the text. If it's done well, it has staff in place. It has lay leadership in place. They're doing worship and Bible study and prayer and acts of service and mission work and so forth. So inherently, I don't see anything wrong at all with a mega church. That is, bigger numbers doesn't, to me, at all equal more evil or bad. If the author of Acts is telling the truth, which I think he is, and Acts, the very first church in Jerusalem, was a very large church, and more specifically, probably a large network of small house churches. But if you put all the original Jerusalemites into a church building, it would have been a very large church. And according to the book of Acts, it was really big. Now, not every church in the New Testament was a big church. Most churches probably averaged between a dozen to 50 because they had to fit in houses, and there were no church buildings probably until the late 3rd, early 4th century. So when a person said a church in the first few centuries, they meant the people there, but also they could mean where someone's house was where they met. But independent church buildings didn't happen for a long time. So what about megachurches these days? Well, a megachurch this day, so if I walk down the street and there's a church that has 5,000 people, that would never have happened in the first century. There weren't that many people in some cities or towns, so that would not have happened. But again, so there's no historical precedent outside of maybe the Jerusalem church, but that was a very large church, so we do have some precedent. But on the modern scale today, like a Joel Osteen's church of 20,000, there's nothing like that in the ancient world. I don't think therefore it means it's bad or evil. Second thing I'd say is, what about the pastors who rake in very large salaries? I also don't see anything at all inherently wrong with that. I know that's very common on Facebook to dog people who make millions of dollars. And I guess millions of dollars might be a lot to me. But when you have main leaders, depends on the church structure. But when you have main leaders like the senior pastor and the executive pastor and the chief operating whatever, these people oversee, it's a gargantuan organization with numerous paid staff members and numerous volunteers. It's a massive job. It's a very, very massive job. People have no idea what goes on inside the office walls during the week. Like, don't you just sit back and read the Bible and prepare a sermon? The answer is no. It is an enormous job. If they were an organization of any secular organization, if they weren't Christian, they work at Chipotle's head offices, whatever, Starbucks. If they oversaw that many staff members, they're not going to get paid $50,000. They'll get paid a whole lot. Now, the main reason is why, hold on a second, I know you're thinking, well, they're pagans, they're not Christians. We do it for Jesus. Well, the reason, of course, we pay a lot typically is because you're paying for specialty. You're not paying per hour hourly wages. You're paying for their specialty. So if a person who can manage and lead people and resources that well, they deserve good pay. And not everyone can. Specialists can, and they deserve to get paid accordingly, but also because of its competitive job market in the world, in America, because a lot of times people who are very good specialists like that, depending on the particular position in the church, they could work anywhere else and get paid a whole lot more money to take care of their families. So I don't think anything inherently bad. If a pastor made a disproportionately amount of money, I mean a huge amount of money more than the congregation, then I might have more of a problem. I mean, for example, my church is a medium-sized church. If I made $1 million a year, I would be overwhelmingly more than the median average of my church. Now, that depends on the circumstance, but though I would love to make $1 million, that'd be really cool. I would pay off my family's debts, my friends' debts, my own, whatever. I would give a lot away because I don't need all that money. I would give an enormous amount of money away. But that's the only way I would receive that much money. Otherwise, I would say, no, I don't want all that money. I don't need all that. I don't need or even want it. So now that depends. Maybe you're a pastor or a CEO, a CFO, that is a main executive pastor at a church that is very large, but they're in a very poor community. Well, if the poor community's average income is $40,000, I don't think the pastor should make $45,000 if it's a very large church because, again, of the specialty. Now, you might think I'm biased because I am a pastor, but maybe I am, but I don't think I am. I'm being as objective and logical as I can be. I want my staff to be paid very well. If they're very qualified and talented, they deserve every penny. Ministry is very demanding. It's very demanding. I remember one of my former professors, and now is the dean of the divinity school, he used to say, if there is any other thing you can do, you should do it. And I remember being put off by that, going, my goodness. I heard him say that several times. If there's anything else you can do, you should do it. And his point was, of course, is this isn't for sissies, but you need to be called by God to do this. If you can do, people who typically are in ministry typically they would say this not logically consistent. They would say, I can't do anything else. What they mean is, I feel called to do this. I can't imagine myself being something else. And that's true. Because it is it is a job that can get you beat up real quickly for a long time, which is why pastors so often burn out. And they deserve to be paid well for that, especially if they're specialists. So I want my staff to be paid well, and that includes any supervisory role who oversees people should get paid appropriately. I think there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Then the question is, what do I do with my money? What do I do with the money? So if an elder board, an ad board, deacons board, whatever, decides to pay staff a larger amount of money, that's their choice. And they come from within the people. If the laity, when it's given them salary, the pastor didn't, in most cases, the pastor didn't, quote unquote, make them do it, didn't put a gun to their head or something. And even that doesn't make them do it, but he might have asked for it. But the bottom line is, for most churches, those large churches, and some kind of board decided that. Well, it's not his or her fault they got paid the money. Then the question I might say, well, I don't want it. As far as I understand, people like Joel Osteen don't even get paid. He makes millions off his sales of his books. I think that's true. I don't know, but probably it's true. I don't know if even Lakewood even pays him anything. So the bottom line is, I don't see anything inherently wrong with that. There are multiple references in the New Testament, both by Jesus and Paul, that says workers are worth their wages. So the question to you is, and to me is, what's it worth to you? What's it worth to you? The other question you ask, are these truly workers for the kingdom, or are they false prophets? That is certainly possible. They're quote unquote a false prophet. But I don't think that's true just because they have large salaries. Again, technically speaking, in the New Testament, a false prophet is a person who claims to speak for God and have a prophetic utterance, a prophetic word from the Spirit, but claims a false message, particularly one that does not espouse or not support the gospel. So if a person is a pastor or a preacher and says, I am a prophet, or I have a word from God, and then that person leads a person away from the true gospel represented in the New Testament, then yes, that person is a false prophet. But one more time, what makes them false is not how much money they make, it is their message. So they very much can be true workers for the kingdom and make a lot of money. That doesn't for 1 second make them false and doesn't make them a false prophet. That's for sure. So that's my view on that. So I think megachurches can be incredibly good. because they have enormous resources. I used to live in Houston, and Second Baptist, which is the largest Baptist church in the world, they had 5 campuses, 5 or 6 at the time, and they have an army of volunteers, millions of dollars of budget. They do massive vacation Bible schools, mission trips around the world, homeless ministries, hungry ministries, Christmas. I mean, it's enormous. So they do a lot of good. I don't know everything they do. All I'm saying is just because they're big doesn't mean they don't do anything good. And I bet the pastor gets paid a lot of money. But in my opinion, he should get paid a lot of money. They're doing a lot of good. So because it's big doesn't, in my opinion, does not at all make it bad. So I'm not against that. Some people, one little quick thing, some people don't like large churches because they say it's just too big. I kind of get swallowed up. And I understand that emotionally and psychologically. If it's a larger church doing it well, then they have a real solid small group ministry. And that's where we get involved, or in church language, we say they get plugged in, an authentic community and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, all right, she continues. Here's what she says in the email. I ask because my background is as a liturgical Lutheran, but our church is struggling to stay alive while these churches are adding members right and left. We now have a contemporary worship service because we think that will attract new members. The problem, our band and musicians are less than professional, and the worship style isn't really a fit with our congregation. Let me pause there real quickly and say, I understand that, sister. The high liturgical mode and style of worship is not as popular. It's very difficult for those who are steeped in that tradition to grasp this. And I really mean, I'm not being mean, I'm condescending at all. I've worked in many churches that have a high liturgical service. What most people cannot understand, because they're so steeped in it, is majority of people in America these days are non-churched. We are now 1, 2, 3 generations now where people grown up and have no idea what church is about. So they did not grow up hearing the organ. They did not grow up hearing Amazing Grace. They did not grow up in liturgical settings. So for most people, you've not had church. If there's not some burnt candles or an organ playing or you sing out of the hymnal, it's not church. But for most people these days when they come to church, if they're a new convert or a baby Christian, that's not going to church for them. They have no background. So it's very different. Things are just different these days. So it is very difficult for liturgical churches typically to, quote, stay alive, as you said. That is exactly right. It's one of the number one reasons why the fastest growing churches in the world are not liturgical. You're hard-pressed to find many churches that started in the last decade that are led by an organ, that are led by hymnals. You'd be hard-pressed to find any. You can find some large churches that are liturgical, but that's because they've been around for a long, long time, and they have typically some kind of contemporary service offerings, and typically they have younger preachers, and typically they have PowerPoints and just modern kind of stuff. The point is, it is difficult. But I also hear your problem that the band and musicians are less than professional. I understand what you're saying. Sometimes the talent pool isn't that high. I understand that. To that, I'd say, you do the best you can, or you hire them, or you start small. My opinion always is, you didn't ask me, but my opinion when it comes to churches, if I were to consult them, is to start with the bare minimum. Can you find a good qualified guitarist, and then a qualified singer, or maybe that person is the same person, or maybe a qualified pianist and so forth that can do modern style, but particularly guitar. Almost every modern song is driven by guitar, not piano. And then you said it's not a fit with your congregation. Well, there is a problem. If your congregation is primarily not that, it's going to be a hard sell for them to buy in. And that's a big deal with these churches who are on the edge of dying. And there are most churches, I think statistically, are on the verge of dying. It's because their congregation has had it their way for so long. They want new blood, they want new people, but they're scared to death to adopt any new changes. And their ability to not let go of their desires kills the church. Study after study after study after study demonstrates this. Your church will die off, literally die off. The old people will be very, very happy when they die that their church never changed, and they'll die off. The church, no more legacy. They'll shut the door. They'll close it. It happens every day all across America, all the time. Here in the small town here now, there's been several church plants in the last several years that all shut down. They couldn't make it. And I'm saying the church is shut down all the time. So it takes a lot of courage for at least a small group of people in these liturgical child churches to have the courage to reach out and say, we're going to try our best to target a different demographic. We're not trying to target our demographic because we're not trying to change your mind. You like organs, you like candles? Wonderful. but we're going to try something else different to get different people. And we're not asking everyone to like everything. We're deliberately targeting something different. So that's one goal. That's one idea. She goes on and says this: I have listened to podcasts from a large megachurch in our city. They are very good. We have even visited this church before and enjoyed the experience, much more than our church's attempt to provide a similar worship service. After visiting, however, there was just something a little creepy about it. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was just so slick and professional, and it didn't feel to me like church. Is that because it is creepy, or because I just have a predefined view of the way church should be? Intimate, quiet, and reverent. Let me pause there and say, I am so daggum impressed that you have the capacity and to be so honest and transparent. I'm serious about this, and I've been in church work for a long time. Very few Christians I've ever met in my life are able to do what you just did to a stranger in an email. That is, maybe it's not creepy. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I just had preset expectations and they didn't meet them. I'm so impressed that you said that. And my response is, I don't know. Maybe it was creepy. Maybe a little both. Of course, I don't know you at all, and I'm sure you're wonderful. In my experience, with people and other human beings, it would be probably a little of both. And what I really mean that. On the one hand, I understand the concept. It's so slick and professional. There's a degree to which, if it's so professional, to us, it feels like Hollywood. It feels like they're trying to impress, they're trying to make it slick and so forth. And I do understand that. And I used to be a little bit bothered by that too. I'm still a little bit bothered only because it's I was going to say unnatural. What I mean is I'm accustomed to seeing really well done performances, light, action, camera, on Broadway or in movies or in really good concerts. I'm not accustomed to seeing that in the church. Well, that's my problem. And it's the church's problem because usually it's done so with such less professionalism and excellence. So what makes it seem creepy is it's like Hollywood has crept into the church. Well, this is just, and I'm speaking of myself, I'm wondering if you feel a similar thing. What feels a little creepy is, wait a second, this is a little too polished. And if you're like me, it's because we're not accustomed to seeing things done so well in the church. It's like Christian movies. I can spot a Christian movie in a heartbeat because the acting's bad, the script's bad, and whatever. You can tell. They don't spend $100 million on a script in a movie. Christian music is this way. I almost always, 99% of the time, you turn the radio on, I can listen to the song for about 3 seconds and go, that's a Christian song. It just has a very different feel. The mix is different. There are some Christian groups now who confuse me. They trick me because they're so well done. But that's the problem. Usually Christian stuff is so not excellent. It's just not excellent. So it feels creepy when it's too polished. That's my view. But polished and professional does not mean fake. If I wear a suit, does wearing a suit make me fake versus wearing what I work out in the gym? Well, of course not. At the same time, simultaneously, you do have a predefined view of the way church should be. And I do too. Everyone does if you've been to church. And if you grew up in a liturgical Lutheran tradition, the intimate, quiet, reverent, you're right. It's going to feel, that's a psychological and emotional thing. And maybe that leads into the intellectual, but maybe not. Maybe intellectually you have already decided that this is the only way God accepts worship, or maybe you've decided this is the best way God deserves worship and Bible study. In my experience, that's not what people have decided based on good, close study of the Bible, Old or New Testament or anything. Rather, it's usually, almost always, a psychological, emotional thing. It's just what they're accustomed to. And they have warm, fuzzy feelings a little bit when they think back on their childhood and go, I remember singing Amazing Grace, and my grandmother was there on my side, and I would lay my head on my mom's arm, and that kind of stuff. And so I wonder if a little bit's going on with you too. If it is just your predefined view, perhaps you can ask God to think if there are other ways to have ways church, quote unquote, should be. Now, and I'm saying that humbly because I have to do the same thing, or I used to, particularly when I had my exposure to megachurches. But what helped me was, if you want any tips or advice, one thing that helped me was I started meeting other people and doing research on what other churches do around the world. What happens in a Mexican church or an African church or an Asian church is quite different. Now, the content is often the same, the gospel and so forth, but what they think is sacred, how church is supposed to be, is very different. In a Pentecostal church for centuries, well, at least a century, upbeat, clapping, loud, screaming, hollering is the way you're supposed to do church. So all I'm saying is it helped me to be exposed to different churches around the world. If we really do believe we're all part of the body of Christ and they're not changing doctrine, well, then different ways of expressing that have to be okay. And that helped me have a broader view. That doesn't mean you can't have your own preferences. I prefer certain music styles over other certain music styles. That's just a preference of mine. It doesn't mean they are less Christian if they don't have my style. But my point is, there's nothing wrong with that. If I went to a very Pentecostal upbeat and they're shouting with a tambourine and rubbing down the aisles, that's distracting for me. Now, I might be able to get accustomed to it, but that's distracting to me now. So I'd prefer not to go to that environment. I don't look down upon them. I don't think I do. I'm searching my heart and mind right now. I don't think I do. It's just that would be distracting to me. But if I go into churches where they don't make a peep, and it's very formal sounding, I don't like that either. So that feels stodgy to me. I don't look down upon them. It's just not my cup of tea. If I went to a Quaker church, it would feel different. You see my point. You would go on and on. So it's okay to have personal style. I prefer that. But if Christians, my little sermonette here, if Christians could just say that, I prefer this, they prefer that. But we both agree on Jesus. We both agree on our doctrine, our ethics, and so forth. It's just how we worship. Maybe the environment is a little different. That's fine. We got some differences. So what? We just prefer it different. And then we just let it be differences. Even within the same congregation, that can happen. I prefer the early service. You prefer the later service. So what? But that's usually what not happens. Usually it's immature. Well, I can't believe those loud drums. That's a loud service. Or I can't believe those dumb organs. That's from 1800s or 1500, whatever. And that stuff should stop. It's not Christian. Her email continues, and I'm almost done. She says, my own church is struggling because of reasons that aren't necessarily associated with worship style. That is just a way to try and slap a Band-Aid on a much larger problem. And that's a little footnote there. I'm saying that's sad, and I'm glad you see that insight. She continues, so our family is definitely looking for a new church. We have been visiting churches off and on for a couple years, but still worshiping regularly at our church. I'm just not so sure about these large churches. Coming from a Lutheran background, the theology of these churches seems a little loosey-goosey. We live in the South, so if you don't attend one of these megas, the other more liturgical churches are in the same boat as the one we attend. And of course, we just wanted to get your opinion on these churches and possibly the theology. I'm speaking primarily of ARC churches. Thank you for your time. Well, I think the ARC, to what she's referring, is the Association of Related Churches. And that's just a church networking group. If she's not talking about that, I'm not sure what she's talking about. As far as the theology being loosey-goosey, I guess you mean... I just like that, loosey-goosey. I don't know if you mean that you think that their gospel isn't good, or the New Testament, Old Testament exegesis isn't sound, or they're not knowing their Bible well. I'm with you, sister, so pay close attention to that. What I mean I'm with you is, it is, in my experience, oftentimes the case that the larger the church, oftentimes they're not very good with their theology, and that drives me crazy. One of the reasons is because of, and this is a long story, but a short response here is, because of a tradition in the last few decades inside of the church realm where church leaders, like an Andy Stanley, who's a big dog in the modern church movement, to make the messages as modern as possible and as applicable as possible, they are not always solid in their theology, and they can not say things or say certain things in an attempt to make everybody happy. And this kind of people-pleasing approach can make it loosey-goosey. Now, that depends on the person, and I hate it when people brand everybody the same. People are not the same. Andy Stanley has some great ideas, and he can read his Bible very well. I'm just saying, in my experience, that mindset and that deliberate belief that we have to be real loose with what we say and real careful and just focus on God's love and blah, blah, or we'll turn them off and they'll leave, that can make a person not really interpret the Bible very well. But they're not all the same. There are some solid people, I'm sure, out there, though I tend not to listen to any preachers ever because I don't like any of them that I've heard so far. I tend to listen to scholars more than the preachers, but I'm sure there's some good ones out there, and hope you can find them. But yeah, be real careful about theology and focus on theology, and that should matter a whole lot to you. Whole lot, because that's the bread and butter. The Apostle Paul makes a really big deal about that to Timothy, that he should always have the doctrine, sound doctrine, and that he should study Scripture and be ready to rebuke and exhort and encourage with all gentleness. So it's a big deal to make sure our theology is right. What's not a big deal is whether or not you like a piano or an organ or a guitar. I mean, come on. That's not just for you, but that's for anybody. So pay attention to theology. Pay attention to what they believe. And one of the best things you can do is look on their website and figure out what they believe and read it. I always do that to my own churches when I visit it all the time. I look online and say, here's what we believe. I read it very carefully. And also, you can also schedule an appointment. Schedule an appointment with the pastor or one of the main pastors and ask them questions. Get to know them. Really, I mean, they're human beings and they have ideas. And it's okay to ask them, hey, I'm church hopping. I want to see what you really do believe. Can I ask you a few questions? You don't need to be scared about that. If that makes you nervous, well, write your questions down or type it up or whatever and take it in with you. Send it ahead of time if you want. Say, hey, I'm just trying to figure things out. Well, God bless you. These are great questions, and I hope that it helps a little bit. And I will join with you in making sure that you and I, as sister and brother in Christ, can be the best examples we can be for our neighbors, but also even for our churches. So let's pray for our pastors, pray for our leaders, regardless of the size of the church, because sister, we need it. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com. If you look at the top, you'll see various tabs that have sermons I've preached, a link to all the podcasts I've done so far, a link to my consulting website. For more information about my consulting, see davidpendergrassconsulting.com. Also, you'll see information about the books I've written that are found on amazon.com. So davidpendergrass.com, one-stop shop, all that you need. If you want to reach out to me, follow me on Twitter, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, and send me a message. I'll see you online.
I gotta run and tell about what the Lord has done.